He was the richest man in town, yet every night he dined alone, his golden plates untouched, his mansion silent as a tomb. No one dared to disturb him. Until one rainy evening, a little girl in a torn dress quietly walked in, sat beside him, and asked a question that would shatter his loneliness forever. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The afternoon light in Asheville carried a gentle kind of sadness, the sort that seemed to hang on the edges of maple leaves before they fell. Inside the Langston Manor, the air was still and proper, every surface polished, every chair precisely angled as if waiting for guests who had forgotten to arrive. Everett Langston sat alone at the end of a long mahogany table that could have seated 12. In front of him, a single plate, a silver fork, and a bowl of soup gone lukewarm. He lifted the spoon, paused midway, and set it back down. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and in the far distance the faint hum of a church bell marked 5 o'clock. For most people it was the hour families gathered for supper. For Everett, it was the hour silence grew louder. Once his dinners had been crowded with people, business partners, friends, the sound of crystal glasses clinking against laughter. But after his wife passed and the company changed hands, those evenings faded into the kind that required only one place setting. He didn't like to admit it, but he had grown used to eating alone, used to solitude as one grows used to pain by letting it harden into routine. Outside, the driveway stirred with gravel crunching under tires. Everett frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors usually meant interruption solicitors, delivery mistakes, or worse, well-meaning neighbors. Asking if he needed company. He pushed his chair back, the wood creaking in protest, and headed toward the door. Through the glass pane, he saw a woman in a modest gray coat, her hair pulled back neatly, standing beside a little girl no taller than the porch railing. The woman held a folded piece of paper in one hand and a hopeful, uncertain smile in the other. The child, clutching a stuffed rabbit, stared up at the grand house with wide, curious eyes. Everett hesitated, then opened the door just enough to keep the draft out. "Mr. Langston," the woman asked, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Grace Miller. We spoke on the phone about the housekeeping position." He nodded curtly. "You're early." Yes, sir. I thought it might be better to come before dark. The roads down here get tricky after sunset." Everett's gaze shifted to the girl. "And this is my daughter, Sophie." Grace said quickly, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "She stays quiet, I promise. I couldn't leave her alone today." Sophie peeked out from behind her mother, her eyes catching the gleam of the chandelier. "You live in a castle," she whispered. "It's a house," Everett corrected sharply, though his tone lacked bite. "Come in. Shoes off on the mat." Grace guided Sophie inside. The child's small boots left faint marks of dried leaves on the marble floor before she stopped to admire her reflection in the mirror. Everett noticed and said nothing. He simply turned toward the hallway. "The cleaning supplies are in the utility room. Kitchen first. I'll be in the study if you need something." Grace nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Langston." As they moved through the space, the manor seemed to breathe again. The scent of lemon polish replaced the dust. A faint hum of life began to pulse in corners, long forgotten. Everett sat at his desk pretending to read the newspaper, but his attention kept drifting toward the sounds dishes clinking, quiet laughter, the rhythmic sweep of a broom. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard such domestic music. Sometime near dusk, Grace appeared at the door with a polite smile. "Sir, I've finished the main floor. Would you like me to return tomorrow to continue upstairs?" Everett nodded, keeping his eyes on the paper. "If you can be punctual." "Yes, sir." She hesitated. "Would you mind if Sophie sat quietly in the kitchen while I work? She can draw or read. She won't be any trouble." His answer was automatic. "As long as she doesn't touch anything." Grace smiled, a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Langston." He didn't reply, but as the front door closed behind them, Everett noticed the faintest trace of warmth lingering in the air, like a candle's scent after the flame goes out. He turned back toward his empty dining table. The soup had gone cold again, but he sat down anyway. He lifted the spoon, hesitated, then whispered to the quiet room, "I suppose it's still supper, isn't it?" Outside, the first stars appeared over the Blue Ridge Hills, and the manor stood a little less silent than before. The following morning arrived wrapped in a pale fog, soft and white, curling through the iron gates like breath. Everett was already awake. He rarely slept past dawn. Habit, he called it. Or perhaps the body's way of reminding him there was no one left to wait for breakfast with. He poured himself black coffee, no sugar, and stood by the window, watching the world stay still. Then from somewhere in the yard came laughter. Small, bright, and terribly alive. He frowned. It took him a second to remember the new housekeeper. And the child. He stepped onto the porch. Grace was shaking dust from a rug over the railing while Sophie danced around a patch of golden leaves, her hair catching light like threads of honey. She was talking to something unseen, her voice carrying that dreamlike rhythm only children understood. Everett cleared his throat, and both turned. "Morning." "Langston," Grace said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Hope we didn't disturb you." "Not at all," he lied. "You're early." "Old habits," she replied with a gentle smile. "I like to start before the sun gets too warm." Sophie held up her drawing pad. "Look, Mr. Langston, I drew your house. And your dog." "I don't have a dog," he said automatically. "You should," she answered, serious now. "Houses this big get lonely." He opened his mouth to reply, but found no words. Instead, he nodded once curtly and went back inside. Yet the image of the little girl spinning among leaves followed him through the morning like an echo he couldn't shake. Later, when he sat down to write letters, business matters, he no longer cared much about. He noticed a faint hum beneath the clack of his pen. Someone was singing. It was Grace, her voice low and tender, almost a whisper. The melody drifted from the kitchen, the kind that reminded him of old church Sundays, of a life that felt smaller and somehow kinder. By noon, the smell of freshly baked bread filled the halls. Everett rose and wandered toward the kitchen door without quite deciding to. Grace turned surprised. "Would you like some? Sir, Sophie and I made too much. I don't eat bread," he said, though the scent betrayed him. Sophie tilted her head. "Not even on Sundays," he glanced at her, then at the loaf steaming on the counter. "It's Thursday," he replied dryly. The girl giggled. Grace smiled but didn't press. She simply cut a small piece, placed it on a plate, and left it on the sideboard as she continued cleaning. Everett hesitated, then picked it up. Warm, soft, the crust crackled faintly between his fingers. He took a bite. It was good, simple, comforting, the kind of flavor that woke forgotten corners of the heart. He set the plate down, irritated with himself for enjoying it. As the day dimmed, he found himself at his study window again. Outside, Grace was gathering tools ready to leave. Sophie, bundled in a little red coat, waited by the gate. Then, something unexpected happened. The child broke free from her mother's hand and ran back toward the porch. She stopped at the foot of the steps, her breath making small clouds in the air. "Mr. Langston," she called. "Can I come tomorrow too?" He hesitated. The right answer was a firm no. It was what people expected from Everett Langston, the man who preferred silence to chatter, solitude to warmth. But her question hung in the air like a spark waiting for permission to glow. He sighed. "That depends," he said finally, voice softer than he intended. "Will you draw on the walls again?" She grinned. "No, sir. I'll bring paper." Something loosened in his chest, a laugh, quiet but real. Grace watched from the gate, surprised but grateful. The girl waved one last time before they disappeared down the driveway, their figures small against the orange wash of evening. Everett lingered on the porch long after they were gone. The world smelled of rain and wood smoke. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. He looked toward the horizon where the last light trembled across the hills and whispered to no one in particular, "Maybe tomorrow won't be quite so empty." Inside, the clock struck 6. The table waited as always, but this time the chair across from him no longer looked quite so painfully vacant. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Blue Ridge Hills, and the manor stood a little less silent than before. By the second week, the Langston Manor no longer felt entirely like a museum. The air inside had shifted barely but noticeably. Windows opened more often. The scent of coffee sometimes mingled with cinnamon. And somewhere between the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the hush of the hallways, a quiet rhythm of life had returned. Everett would never admit it out loud, but he no longer minded the soft sounds of movement beyond his study door. the faint clatter of dishes, the humming, the occasional sound of a child's pencil scratching on paper. It filled the spaces he had long ago surrendered to dust and memory. Grace Miller was precise in her work, the kind of woman who believed small things, folded towels, polished silver, were how one expressed respect for the world. She was careful with her words, too. Always, yes, sir, or no, sir, and never more than necessary. Yet there was a gentleness about her, something Everett could sense even when he pretended not to. Sophie, on the other hand, was sunlight with shoes on. She filled each corner of the manor with curiosity, leaving behind trails of laughter and half-finished drawings taped in odd places on the pantry door beside the piano, even under the stairs. Walter, the elderly groundskeeper, had found one fluttering in the wind near the porch and brought it inside like a discovered treasure. It was a picture of a man sitting alone at a large table. On the other side, a small note written in childish letters. Maybe he just needs a friend. Everett had found it resting against his newspaper one morning. He didn't ask how it got there. He only folded it carefully and slipped it into a book. That afternoon, as sunlight painted amber stripes across the hallway, Everett caught sight of Grace in the dining room. She was standing on a small stool, dusting the upper shelves of the china cabinet. He noticed her move slower than usual, a hand pressing against her lower back as if steadying herself. "You should ask Walter for help," Everett said from the doorway. Grace startled, nearly dropping the feather duster. "Oh, Mr. Langston, I didn't see you there. It's fine, really. I'm used to doing things myself." "You'll hurt yourself," he said, the tone more gruff than he intended. "And I don't need another liability." She smiled politely. "Then I'll be careful, sir." He lingered a moment longer than was proper, then nodded and walked away. Yet, as he passed the staircase, he heard Sophie's voice from the kitchen, soft and secretive. Are you okay?" "You're doing that face again." Grace lowered her voice, thinking Everett was out of earshot. "It's just a little pain, sweetheart. Don't worry, we need this job." Something in that tone, tired but steady, followed Everett the rest of the day. Later that evening, while sorting through old mail, he found himself rereading the letter from Grace's employment agency. There had been a note attached: "Single mother, reliable, needs stability." He had barely noticed those words before. Now they felt heavier. The next morning when Grace arrived, Everett did something unexpected. He met her at the door. "There's no need to climb shelves today," he said. "Focus on the downstairs rooms." She blinked, surprised. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. That's kind." "It's practical," he replied, clearing his throat. "No one wants an accident in their house." Grace smiled. "Of course." Behind her, Sophie tugged at her mother's coat. "Can I draw in the music room again?" Everett frowned. "Just don't touch the piano." Sophie nodded earnestly. "I won't promise." He returned to his study but left the door slightly open this time. He could hear Sophie humming softly as she drew. Grace dusted and arranged the vases, her movements steady and precise. And though the old manor still creaked with age, it no longer felt lonely. Around noon, a sudden noise startled them all, a sharp crash from the parlor. Everett rushed out, heart pounding. The antique clock, his late wife's favorite, lay shattered on the floor. Sophie stood nearby, her eyes wide, tears forming fast. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I was just looking." Grace turned pale. "Sophie, oh, Mr. Langston, I'm so sorry." Everett looked at the fragments, then at the trembling child. Something old and sharp inside him stirred a familiar instinct to scold, to retreat behind anger, because it was easier than feeling disappointment. But then he saw her small hands shaking, her lip quivering, and something stopped him. He knelt down, his voice low. "Did you cut yourself?" Sophie sniffled. "No, sir." "Then it's just glass," he said quietly. "Glass can be replaced." Grace exhaled, relief flooding her face. "Thank you, sir. I'll clean it right away." He shook his head. "Leave it. I'll call Walter." Grace hesitated, eyes shining with something she didn't dare say. As she guided Sophie away, Everett found himself staring at the shards on the floor, the small reflection of his own face fractured in the glass. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps he was the one who'd been broken for too long. That night, rain rolled softly against the tall windows of Langston Manor, the kind of rain that asked for silence and reflection. Everett sat by the fireplace, a single lamp flickering beside him, reading the same sentence in his book over and over without really seeing it. His thoughts kept returning to the sound of breaking glass, to the child's frightened eyes. and to Grace's trembling apology that carried something deeper than fear of losing a job. He finally closed the book and rose. The hallway lights had been dimmed, but faint music floated from the kitchen, a gentle lullaby hummed rather than sung. Everett followed the sound, slow and uncertain, until he stopped by the doorway. Grace was sitting at the small servants' table, her back turned. Sophie lay asleep across her lap, one hand still holding a crayon. On the table sat a half-drawn picture, 3 figures at a dinner table, the smallest one smiling between 2 adults. Grace's head tilted as she watched her daughter's face, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead with the kind of tenderness Everett hadn't seen in years. He stood there unseen, feeling like an intruder in a sacred moment. The old ache behind his ribs, the one he used to drown in work, returned quietly. He turned to leave, but his foot brushed against the edge of the doorframe. Grace startled, her eyes meeting his. I didn't mean to disturb," he said, awkwardly formal. "It's all right, sir." Her voice was gentle but tired. She fell asleep before supper. "I didn't have the heart to wake her." Everett nodded. His eyes fell on the picture. "You draw together often?" Grace smiled faintly. "She loves it. Says it makes her feel like she can make the world kinder than it really is." He considered that for a long moment. "A foolish hope," he said at last. Maybe Grace replied softly, "But some hopes are what keep us standing." The rain deepened outside. Everett hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever take a day off?" Grace chuckled quietly. "Days off are a luxury, Mr. Langston. For now, this job is what keeps us safe." He wanted to ask safe from what, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he cleared his voice. "You should get some rest. You both can start late tomorrow." Grace looked at him in surprise. "That's very kind." "It's practical," he said again, though the tone no longer carried authority. As he turned to leave, she whispered, "Thank you, sir." He didn't answer. But when he reached his study, he found himself lighting the second lamp, the one on the opposite side of the room, simply because he realized it made the space feel less lonely. The next morning, Everett awoke earlier than usual. He found a note on his desk written in careful handwriting. "Good morning, Mr. Langston. I hope it's all right that Sophie left you something in the dining room." He frowned, curious. When he stepped into the dining hall, the faint smell of toast and sugar greeted him. On the table sat a plate with a single pancake in the shape of a heart, uneven but honest. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. He opened it and found Sophie's drawing from the night before, now finished. 3 figures again sitting at the same long table. The man in the middle looked unmistakably like him, a crooked smile on his face. Underneath, in neat, colorful letters, "For Mr. Langston, because everyone deserves breakfast with someone." He stood still for a long time. Something inside him shifted, not a crack, but a slow, patient thaw. By the time Grace and Sophie arrived that morning, Everett was already in the kitchen. He had boiled water for tea and arranged 3 cups. When Grace entered, surprised, he simply gestured to the counter. "I didn't know what kind you drink," he said gruffly, "so I made both." She blinked. "You made tea. I'm not entirely helpless," he muttered then. After a pause, "Sit down if you like. There's enough for all of us." Grace hesitated, then smiled. "Thank you, sir." Sophie climbed onto the chair beside him, wide-eyed. "Does this mean we're friends now?" Everett looked at her, the little spark of mischief, the soft hope in her eyes, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to smile fully. "We'll see," he said, voice low, almost warm. And somewhere between the steam of tea and the rhythm of the falling rain, the house felt alive again, as if it had been waiting all along for someone small and brave enough to open its doors. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard such domestic music. Morning sunlight slanted across the wide porch, laying soft patterns on the faded rug near the entrance. It was a gentle light, the kind that warmed without demanding attention, the kind that made even old wood look forgiving. Everett Langston stood by the front window, coffee cup in hand, watching the world wake up beyond the gates. A milk truck passed, a paperboy waved, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Yet they felt almost foreign in this house that had once known only silence. It had been 3 weeks since Grace and Sophie began working here. The manor now breathed with a rhythm Everett couldn't quite name, a pulse he didn't control, but one he had grown used to. The mornings brought motion chatter, the clinking of dishes, and the faint smell of laundry soap. Even Walter, the groundskeeper, seemed to whistle more often. Everett would pretend to ignore it all, but truthfully he listened. The laughter, the little footsteps, the song hummed off key, they had become part of the air he inhaled each day. That morning, as he read through a dull financial report, he noticed something odd near his study door. A thin strip of white paper was sticking out from the bottom as if someone had slid it under. He bent to pick it up. A drawing, crayon lines in every direction, bright and messy but full of intention. It was the manner easily recognizable, the tall windows, the porch railing, the swing he never used. In front stood a man and a little girl. Both were smiling. The man had gray hair and a crooked tie. Above them in uneven letters Sophie had written, "Good morning, Mr. Langston." Everett stared at it longer than he meant to. He wasn't used to receiving things that weren't bills or condolences. For a brief, ridiculous moment, he wanted to fold it neatly and keep it somewhere safe. But then the old instinct returned, the one that warned against sentiment. He placed the drawing on his desk beneath a stack of papers, as if hiding it might protect him from what it stirred. Later that afternoon, he found Sophie in the hallway, crouched by the wall, her small hands smudged with color. "What are you doing?" he asked. She jumped, startled. "Oh, I'm making something for you, for me," she nodded, eyes wide and earnest. "You always sit by yourself, so I thought maybe your office needed more sunshine." She pointed to the lower part of the wall where she had been quietly taping more of her drawings, a series of bright little houses and birds, and one that looked suspiciously like a teapot with eyes. He frowned, though not unkindly. "You shouldn't stick things on the wall." "I used little tape pieces," she explained quickly. "They come off easy." Everett sighed. "Just not near the wood panels." Her face lit up. "Okay, Mr. Langston." As she ran off, the hallway seemed to glow a little brighter, not from sunlight, but from something softer. The kind of warmth you feel when a child believes in you more than you deserve. That evening, as Grace was finishing the last of the kitchen cleanup, Everett lingered by the doorframe. "She's quite the artist," he said. Grace looked up from the sink, smiling faintly. "She loves colors, says drawings are her way of talking to people when words get shy." He nodded, unsure what to do with the tenderness that sentence carried. "She shouldn't waste her time drawing me." Grace chuckled softly. "She doesn't see it that way. She says you remind her of the man who used to give her lollipops at the library." "I've never given anyone a lollipop." "I know," she said, rinsing the plates, "but she believes you would." He didn't answer. He turned toward the living room, but paused at the sight of the grand piano, untouched for years. A small yellow paper sat on the stool. Another drawing. This one showed the same man and girl, only now sitting at a piano, surrounded by what looked like falling stars. On the bottom corner, a tiny note read, "So you don't forget music." Everett stood there still as the furniture around him, the words echoing in the space between memory and regret. Music. The word pulled at something buried deep, the evenings when his late wife Marion played that very piano, and he would sit beside her pretending to read while she played. He touched one key softly. The note was slightly out of tune, but it trembled alive. The sound startled him more than he expected. He pressed another key, then another. The melody was broken, halting, but something inside him, something small and fragile, shifted toward life again. Behind him, Grace's voice floated gently from the hallway. "That was lovely, Mr. Langston." He froze. "I was just checking the instrument," he said quickly. She smiled. "Of course. Sometimes even instruments need a little attention to remember their purpose." He said nothing, but when she turned to leave, she caught the faintest hint of a smile at the edge of his lips. That night, before locking his study, Everett returned the first drawing, the one she had slid under the door, to his desk's surface. He didn't hide it beneath papers this time. Instead, he leaned it against the lamp where the light could reach it. Outside, the crickets began their nightly choir, and for once, the old house listened without feeling lonely. The next few mornings came with a quiet routine that Everett pretended not to notice, but secretly awaited. Every day after breakfast, a new piece of paper appeared under his study door. Sometimes a sunrise over the hills, sometimes a steaming cup of coffee, sometimes simply the word "hello" written in pink crayon surrounded by tiny hearts. Sophie never signed them, but he knew. The handwriting was too alive to belong to anyone else. He found himself checking the floor before opening the door as though expecting another letter from a world far kinder than the one he knew. And when one morning no drawing appeared, a small frown settled on his face before he could stop it. He opened the door and saw Grace wiping the hallway mirror, her movements slower than usual. Sophie was nowhere in sight. "She's not feeling well," Grace said quietly when she caught his look. "A little fever. I told her to rest at home today." Everett nodded, hiding the concern that rose unexpectedly in his chest. "Children recover quickly." "Yes," Grace said, smiling faintly. "She'll be back to her colors in no time." But that day, the house felt heavier again, like the air had thickened. The walls returned to silence, and even the ticking of the clock seemed impatient. Everett tried to focus on his reading, but ended up pacing the room instead. He told himself it was absurd to miss the sound of a child's footsteps, yet he found himself glancing toward the empty hallway more than once. By late afternoon, rain clouds gathered over Asheville. He decided to drive into town, something he rarely did anymore. The old Ford groaned as he turned the key dust lifting from the dashboard. The road down Biltmore Avenue was lined with soaked leaves, the town humming with umbrellas and headlights. He stopped by the small corner store where Grace often bought groceries for the house. Inside, he saw her at the counter, holding a small paper bag and counting change. Her shoulders were damp, her hair sticking slightly to her neck. When she turned and saw him, surprise flickered across her face. "Mr. Langston, I didn't expect to see you here." "You're out in the rain," he said simply. "You could have asked Walter. I didn't want to trouble anyone. Sophie needed medicine." He nodded, hesitated, then said, "Is she all right?" Grace's voice softened. "Just the flu. She'll be fine in a day or two. She wanted to draw you something, but I told her to rest." Everett cleared his throat. "Tell her she can deliver it when she's better." Grace smiled. "I will." When they stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. Everett, in an uncharacteristic gesture, opened his umbrella and held it above both of them. Grace blinked in surprise, then whispered, "Thank you." "It's practical," he muttered, though his tone had lost its usual stiffness. They walked quietly toward her small car. Before she got in, Grace turned to him. "You know she draws those pictures because she says they make you less lonely." He gave a faint ironic smile. "I didn't realize I looked lonely. Children see things we hide from ourselves," she said softly, closing the car door. He watched her drive away until the red taillights disappeared into the gray. The umbrella trembled slightly in his hand, the drizzle turning silver under the streetlight. When he returned to the manor, the house greeted him with its familiar silence. He left the umbrella near the door, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The fire crackled low, its glow reflecting off the framed photographs on the wall. His late wife smiling beside him in another lifetime. He reached for a book but found himself opening a drawer instead. Inside were the folded drawings Sophie had made small bursts of color against years of gray. He arranged them neatly on the table one by one like someone setting a table for guests long awaited. He didn't notice Walter standing at the doorway until the old man spoke. "Sir, it's been a long time since this room looked lived in." Everett didn't look up. Perhaps it just needed better art. Walter chuckled. Or better company. That night, Everett left his study door open. He didn't plan to, but when he reached for the handle, something told him to let the air move freely again. And in the stillness that followed, he realized what the child had done. With nothing more than paper and color, she had drawn something he thought he'd lost, not just warmth, but invitation. A quiet reminder that even walls could learn to listen again. Outside, the rain eased into a whisper against the windows, soft and endless. He closed his eyes and murmured to the empty hall, "Good night, kid." And though the house made no reply, it seemed to breathe in time with him, a steady rhythm, faint but alive, the heartbeat of something gently returning. The town of Asheville had begun to dress itself for Thanksgiving. Store windows shimmered with garlands, coffee shops smelled of cinnamon and roasted nuts, and even the old church bell across the hill seemed to ring a little softer. Inside the Langston Manor, warmth gathered in small, unexpected corners, a folded blanket left on a chair. A child's laughter echoing faintly through the hall, the aroma of apple pie rising from the kitchen where Grace worked late. Everett moved slower these days, not from age, but from thought. Ever since Sophie's illness and her little drawings, he had felt something in himself quietly rearranging like a house being aired after years of dust. He couldn't name the feeling, but it followed him everywhere, to the porch at dawn, to the dinner table at dusk. That morning, he found a small envelope placed neatly on his desk. Inside, written in Sophie's uneven hand, were the words, "Thank you for the umbrella." The letter was short, but the sentence felt heavy with care. He kept reading it until the ink seemed to breathe. Later, Grace appeared at the study door, wiping her hands on a towel. She insisted on writing that herself, she said. Wouldn't go to bed until it was done. Everett smiled faintly. Her spelling's better than mine was at that age. She'll be happy to hear that. He hesitated. Does she know about Thanksgiving? Grace looked at him, curious. We usually just make something simple. Last year we had soup and a bit of chicken. Why? He cleared his throat. Because this year, I suppose, you could have dinner here, both of you. Grace blinked. Here in the main dining room. Yes, I don't eat much these days, and it feels wrong to let the house stay empty on a holiday meant for company. He paused. You'd be doing me a favor. Grace's lips curved into a quiet smile, not out of surprise, but something gentler, like relief. Then we'd be honored, Mr. Langston. That evening, the house seemed alive in ways it hadn't been for decades. Walter brought in firewood. The kitchen buzzed with the rhythm of chopping and laughter. Sophie darted between rooms, humming something that barely held a tune, but carried joy all the same. When dinner was ready, Everett walked slowly to the grand dining room. The same long table where he once ate alone now glowed under soft amber light. 3 places were set simple but full of meaning. He took his seat at the head, feeling strangely nervous. Sophie climbed onto her chair, wearing a dress too big for her but full of color. She grinned. Mr. Langston, do we have to say a prayer before eating? Grace laughed softly. Only if you want to, honey. Sophie nodded solemnly and folded her hands. Thank you, God, for the food, and for letting Mr. Langston not be so lonely anymore. Everett froze mid-motion, his fork halfway to the plate. Grace shot her daughter a gentle warning glance, but Sophie looked at him with open innocence. That's a good thing, right? He swallowed hard, then smiled a slow, careful smile that trembled into something real. Yes, Sophie, that's a very good thing. The meal went on with laughter and quiet stories. Grace spoke about the town parade and how Sophie wanted to see the floats. Everett listened not as a host, but as someone who had finally remembered how to belong at a table. The clinking of cutlery, the warmth of the fire, it all blended into something musical, something almost holy. When dessert came, Sophie placed a small paper turkey she had made beside his plate. On its wings she had written in marker, Family isn't who you live with, it's who makes you smile. He stared at it for a long time before saying softly, That's the truest thing anyone's ever told me. After dinner, Grace began clearing dishes, but Everett stopped her. Leave them for the morning, he said. The house hasn't seen a mess this happy in years. She laughed, if you're sure. As the night deepened, the wind outside began to howl faintly through the trees, carrying the promise of an early winter. Grace tucked Sophie in a guest room near the kitchen, and Everett lingered by the doorway watching her sleep. Her small hand clutching the paper turkey, her breathing steady and peaceful. Something about the sight unraveled him completely. He turned away before Grace could see the tears forming. When she walked up beside him, he said quietly, She reminds me of how my daughter used to sleep. Grace's expression softened. You had a daughter? He nodded, voice hoarse. Her name was Emily. She passed when she was about Sophie's age. Grace didn't speak. She simply stood next to him, close enough that silence itself became a kind of comfort. The fire downstairs crackled, filling the manor with a soft golden heartbeat. Everett looked toward the flickering light and whispered almost to himself, I never thought I'd see warmth in this house again. And as the embers glowed brighter, Sophie murmured in her sleep from the next room, good night. Grandpa Everett. Neither of them had taught her to say that. Everett froze where he stood, one hand clutching the stair rail. For a long, trembling moment, he said nothing, only closed his eyes, letting the word Grandpa sink deep into the quiet corners of his heart. Everett didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the old empty quiet. It was gentle, alive, like a deep breath after years of holding it in. He sat by the fire, the paper turkey beside his teacup. Sophie's words still echoing in the warm air. Family isn't who you live with. It's who makes you smile. He turned the little paper bird between his fingers. feeling the uneven edges, the faint trace of crayon wax, as though those small imperfections were proof of something pure. Grace came downstairs in her robe, rubbing her arms against the chill. "You're still awake," she whispered. "Old habits," he said softly. "When my wife was alive, we used to stay up after Thanksgiving dinner, talking about nothing. I suppose I forgot what that felt like." Grace smiled, her eyes glimmering in the light of the fire. "Maybe tonight reminded you." He looked at her, really looked, and for a second the years between them blurred. "It did," he admitted. "You and your girl. You brought something back into this place I thought was gone forever." She placed a hand on the back of the chair, voice gentle as the falling snow outside. "We didn't bring it, Mr. Langston. It was still here. It just needed a little warmth to wake up." Everett said nothing. He just nodded slowly, eyes drifting toward the staircase. Through the quiet, the sound of Sophie's soft breathing floated down like a melody. It was the simplest sound in the world, but it filled the manor like music. He rose, walked toward the stairs, and paused halfway up. Snowflakes brushed against the window glass, melting instantly into tiny rivers of silver. He thought of all the winters he had spent in silence, believing loneliness was dignity, that grief was a debt that must be paid forever. But that night, for the first time in decades, he felt forgiven by the world, by his memories, maybe even by himself. He turned off the last light in the hall and listened once more. From the guest room came Sophie's sleepy murmur, soft as a prayer. "Good night, Grandpa Everett." He froze. The words landed deep, as if they'd been waiting years to find him. A quiet laugh broke in his chest, half sob, half joy, and he pressed a trembling hand to his heart. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard such domestic music. The first snow of December blanketed Asheville in a hush so deep it felt sacred. The Langston Manor, once a place of echoing footsteps and closed doors, now glowed faintly in the morning light. Grace brewed coffee in the kitchen, while Sophie built a crooked snowman outside, humming through her scarf. Everett watched her from the window, the steam of his cup blurring the world for a moment. He thought he had forgotten how peace looked, how it sounded, but lately the house seemed to hum with small, beautiful noises that healed in silence. He stood there longer than usual, until Walter cleared his throat from the doorway. "Sir, there's someone at the gate asking for you." Everett frowned. "At this hour, a lady, sir. Says she's family." He set his cup down, uneasy. He hadn't heard that word family used about him in years. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, brushing snow from the pines as he stepped toward the porch. A silver car idled at the gate, its engine humming low. From it emerged a woman in her 40s, elegant coat heels sinking slightly into the snow. Dark hair coiled neatly beneath a hat. Her face was familiar, though time had drawn sharpness into the corners. "Claudia," he said flatly. "Uncle Everett," she replied with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're looking, well, I doubt that's why you're here." She laughed lightly, brushing snow from her gloves. "I was in town, thought I'd visit. You haven't returned my calls in months." "I haven't returned anyone's calls in years," he said. Claudia glanced toward the manor, her gaze flicking briefly to the window where Sophie's snowman leaned precariously. "So this is where you've been hiding. I've heard things, you know, that you've got company now." Everett's jaw tightened. "They're not company. They work here." "Of course," she said smoothly, her tone dripping disbelief. "The help always stays long enough to decorate the garden, I see." Her words fell like cold rain. For a moment Everett wanted to turn away, but he caught himself. The old him might have. The new him, the one Sophie's laughter had softened, no longer ran from confrontation. "Claudia, whatever rumor brought you here, leave it at the gate," he said evenly. "You're welcome inside only if you plan to behave." She smiled again, thinner this time. "Then I'll behave." Inside, the air shifted. Grace met them at the door, wiping her hands on a towel, her polite smile faltering when she saw the visitor. Claudia's gaze scanned her up and down, her simple dress, her worn apron, the quiet strength in her stance, and lingered a moment too long. "So you must be the new housekeeper," Claudia said sweetly. Grace didn't rise to the bait. "I take care of the house," she said softly, "and sometimes it takes care of me too." Sophie came running in just then, cheeks red from the cold. "Mr. Langston, my snowman's taller than me now." She stopped, seeing Claudia. "Who's that?" Before Everett could answer, Claudia crouched slightly, her tone falsely tender. "I'm his niece, dear. That makes me your family, too." Sophie blinked. "I already have a family." Claudia straightened, her expression tightening. "Charming," she murmured. Everett cleared his throat. "That's enough, Claudia." Lunch was awkward. The table that had recently been full of laughter now felt smaller, colder. Claudia talked about investment portfolios, real estate, and family legacy. Grace kept her head down, serving quietly while Sophie doodled on a napkin. Her crayons spread like a small rebellion of color against the sterile tone of conversation. "So," Claudia said at last, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, "you've changed the will again, haven't you?" Everett looked up sharply. "Excuse me? Oh, come now, I'm not naive. You're spending time with strangers, opening your doors to God knows who. I imagine your lawyers have noticed too." "Claudia, you think this woman and her child actually care about you?" Her voice rose sharp as the clatter of cutlery. "They're here because they need a roof, not because they love you. Don't you see you're being used?" The room fell silent. Sophie looked up, eyes wide, while Grace's hands froze mid-motion, a plate trembling slightly between her fingers. Everett's stare hardened, the calm in his voice colder than any winter wind. "Claudia, you are in my house," he said quietly, "and you will not speak to them that way." She gave a bitter laugh. There it is, the proud patriarch defending the poor maid and her kid. "How poetic." "Leave," he said simply. Her face reddened. "You'll regret this. When they walk away with your kindness and your money, you'll remember who tried to warn you." Everett stood, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. "The only thing I'll regret is letting you turn this house cold again." Claudia grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. But before she left, she turned to Sophie, her voice cutting like frost. "Be careful, little one. People who play family games with old men usually lose." The door slammed behind her. The silence that followed felt endless. Sophie's drawing had smudged her small hand, trembling slightly as she looked up at him. "Did we make her mad?" she whispered. Everett knelt beside her. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "She was mad before she came here." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Steady, calm. Don't you worry. Some storms don't last." Outside, though, the real storm had begun, wind pressing against the windows, snow swirling heavier by the minute. Inside, Everett stared into the flames of the fireplace and realized Claudia hadn't only brought weather. She'd brought back something darker, the weight of old guilt, the echo of every mistake that once kept him from love. And as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, he couldn't help but feel that the peace they'd built was about to be tested. The wind howled harder that night, shaking the windows until the old house seemed to breathe with it. Grace tucked Sophie into bed, her small hand still clutching a crayon. "Is Mr. Langston sad?" the girl whispered. Grace brushed a curl from her forehead. "He just remembered something painful. Sometimes grown-ups need a little quiet to heal." Downstairs, Everett sat by the dying fire. Claudia's words replaying like distant thunder. "They're here because they need a roof, not because they love you." For years he had believed money could protect him from betrayal. Now it felt like a wall he'd built too high. Grace appeared silently in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea. "She doesn't know you," she said softly. "And Sophie? She doesn't want anything but your time." He took the cup from her, the warmth grounding him. "It's strange," he murmured. "All my life I thought being needed was a burden. Now it feels like a blessing." Grace smiled faintly. "That's because you finally stopped counting what you've lost." Outside, snow pressed against the glass, the world hushed in white. Everett rose, walked to the window, and saw Sophie's half-finished snowman leaning under the weight of new snow. He opened the door, stepped into the cold, and gently fixed the crooked head until it stood straight again. From somewhere behind him, Grace's voice drifted through the night. "Some storms just test how strong your home has become." He turned, smiling faintly through the frost. Inside, the firelight glowed across the hallway, and above it, the sound of Sophie's quiet breathing returned, steady, innocent, unafraid. Everett closed the door and whispered to the dark. Let it storm, then. The wind eased. The snow fell slower, and in the fragile quiet that followed the old house seemed to sing again. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard such domestic music. The storm had passed by morning, leaving a silver calm over Asheville. Sunlight glimmered on the snow, turning the Langston Manor into something softer, almost gentle. For the first time in years, Everett woke before the clock. He stood by the window in his robe, watching how the light crept across the floorboards like a promise that the worst was over. Downstairs came the faint clatter of pans, the easy sound of a home alive again. Grace's voice drifted from the kitchen, low and warm, followed by Sophie's high laughter, the kind that filled the halls faster than music. Everett smiled without meaning to. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to expect those sounds every morning. He went down, drawn by the smell of butter and coffee. Grace was teaching Sophie to roll biscuit dough, their fingers covered in flour. "Good morning," he said, voice still rough from sleep. Grace looked up, surprised but smiling. "You're up early. We're experimenting with breakfast." Sophie grinned, nose dusted white. "You have to help Mr. Langston. That's what Grandpa always says, everyone should help at breakfast." Grace froze for half a second, realizing what her daughter had just said. Everett did too. The word Grandpa hung in the air like a tiny miracle neither of them wanted to break. He knelt beside Sophie, pretending to inspect the dough. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose I'd better do what Grandpa says." Sophie clapped her hands. "Then you stir." Grace caught his gaze for a brief moment, gratitude and warmth passing between them, silent but strong. Everett took the wooden spoon and stirred carefully, his movements clumsy but sincere. "You're hired," Grace teased. He smiled. "Don't be too sure. I've been fired from better kitchens." They laughed, all three of them, and for a few minutes the house sounded the way it must have, years ago, busy, bright, alive. When the biscuits were baking, Everett leaned against the counter. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think mornings were just empty time between obligations. But lately they've started to feel like something else, like what Grace asked, like beginnings," he said. Grace turned back to the oven, pretending to check the biscuits so he wouldn't see her smile. The light through the window touched her hair, and for a moment Everett thought she looked like part of the sunlight itself, something gentle that had been meant to return. When the biscuits came out, golden, Sophie cheered. "We did it. Grandpa would be proud." Everett looked at her, the innocence in her grin, the way she said the word without hesitation, and something inside him softened all over again. He sat at the table, tore a biscuit in half, and handed the warm piece to her. "To the best bakers in North Carolina," he said. Grace laughed. "That's generous of you." "Truthful," he replied. "And besides, I've had enough burnt toast in my life to know the difference." The morning passed in quiet happiness, the kind that never announces itself, just slips into ordinary moments and makes them shine. But as the clock struck 10, the telephone on the wall began to ring. The sound cut through the peace like a cold wind. Grace looked at him. Everett hesitated, then answered. "Langston residence," a man's voice spoke on the other end, steady but formal. "Mr. Everett Langston, this is Detective Nolan, Asheville Police Department. I believe we need to talk about Grace Miller." Everett straightened his eyes, flicking to Grace, who had gone still by the counter. "What about her?" he asked quietly. "It's regarding an open case, sir," the detective said. "I'd prefer to discuss it in person." The line clicked dead. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The smell of biscuits lingered in the air, sweet and warm. But the peace of the morning had vanished, replaced by the sharp, cold echo of the past knocking once more. Detective Nolan arrived before noon. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the uneasy silence that had settled over the manor. Everett watched from the porch as the man stepped out of his sedan, mid-40s, gray suit badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Langston," the detective said, shaking off the cold. "I appreciate your time." Everett nodded. "Come inside." Grace stood at the kitchen doorway, pale but composed. Sophie had been sent upstairs with a storybook and a promise of cookies later. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were listening. Nolan took out a small notebook. "This will only take a few minutes. We've been trying to locate Grace Miller for almost a year. She left Charlotte after a construction site accident. Her husband, Daniel Miller, passed away. There were hospital debts, a custody dispute with her late husband's family, and then she disappeared." Grace's voice trembled. "I wasn't running from the law, detective. I was running from people who wanted to take my daughter. They said I was unfit because I couldn't pay for the funeral." Nolan studied her for a long moment, then closed his notebook. "The case isn't criminal anymore. The court dismissed the petition months ago. I just needed to confirm you and the girl were safe." Everett felt something unclench in his chest. He poured the man coffee, the old habit of a host returning naturally. "Then I assume you have what you need." The detective nodded. "More than enough. You have good people here, Mr. Langston. Take care of them." After he left, Grace sank into a chair. Her hands shook as she covered her face. Everett stood beside her for a moment, unsure if words would help. Then he simply placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Not while you're under this roof." Tears slipped through her fingers, quiet and steady. "I kept thinking I'd lose everything again." Everett's voice softened. "Sometimes we run because we're afraid no one will wait for us to stop. But you've stopped now, Grace. You're home." Sophie came downstairs, clutching her doll. "Is Mommy okay?" Grace wiped her eyes and smiled faintly. "Mommy's fine, sweetheart." The little girl climbed onto Everett's lap without hesitation, her small hand resting on his. "Are you okay too, Mr. Langston?" He nodded. "Better than I've been in years." Outside, the clouds began to break apart, streaks of blue cutting through the gray. Grace watched the light shift across the floorboards and thought it looked like forgiveness taking shape. Everett glanced toward the window, the garden where Walter tended the soil, the hills beyond turning green again, and realized something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. He looked at Grace and Sophie, two lives that had wandered into his and somehow repaired what years of wealth and solitude had broken. "Breakfast tomorrow," Grace asked quietly, standing with her daughter's hand in hers. Everett smiled. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The warmth returned to the room, not sudden but steady, like a fire that knows it will last the night. And though the echoes of the past still lingered in the corners of the old house, they no longer sounded like ghosts. They sounded like life. Detective Nolan removed his hat, shaking off the snow. The house smelled faintly of biscuits and wood smoke, too peaceful for what he'd come to say. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "you were named in a case 3 years ago. We just need to clear a few things." Grace nodded, her voice barely steady. "I never hurt anyone. I tried to stop a fight. One man fell, hit his head. They said I ran. I was just scared." Nolan studied her face, then turned to Everett. "And you're willing to vouch for her?" Everett met his gaze calmly. "I'll vouch for what I've seen, a woman who works hard, cares deeply, and tells the truth even when it costs her." For a moment, the detective's expression softened. He pulled out a small folder. "The man recovered, Mrs. Miller. He withdrew the complaint a year later, but no one could find you to tell you." Grace blinked. "He... what?" "It's over," Nolan said gently. "You're not in trouble." Grace covered her mouth, tears breaking free. Sophie clung to her waist, whispering, "See, Mommy told you everything would be okay." Everett stood silent, his eyes glistening in the firelight. Nolan tipped his hat and left without another word, the snow swallowing his footsteps. When the door closed, Grace turned to Everett. "You didn't have to stand by me like that." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, eyes full of gratitude. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, something lighter took its place. For the first time in years, the old house felt completely still, not because it was empty, but because it was at peace. For a while after Detective Nolan left, no one spoke. The ticking of the clock was the only sound in the room. Grace sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to catch her breath. Sophie climbed into her lap, wrapping her little arms around her. Everett poured 3 cups of tea, one for Grace, one for himself, and one that Sophie would never finish. He set them down quietly. "It's over," he said. "You can stop running now." Grace nodded, tears still clinging to her lashes. "I thought I'd never hear those words again." He smiled gently. "Then maybe you were just waiting to hear them from the right person." Sophie looked up, curious. "Does this mean we can stay forever?" Grace froze, afraid to answer. Everett did it for her. "It means you're home," he said. The girl grinned and hugged him before he could react. For the first time, he didn't stiffen or pull away. He just laughed softly, the sound warm and surprised. Grace watched them, her eyes full, her heart too full for words. Outside, the snow began to melt under the afternoon sun. Water dripped from the porch roof, steady and slow, like time moving forward again. Everett looked out through the window and exhaled the kind of breath that comes when the past finally lets go. He turned back toward them. Grace smiled, her voice soft but sure. "You saved us." He shook his head. No, Grace, you reminded me what saving someone looks like. Sophie giggled. You both talk too much, she said, reaching for a biscuit. They laughed together, the sound small and real. The kind of sound that stays in a house long after the fire burns out. And for the first time since Marion's passing, Everett realized the silence he'd feared for so long was gone, replaced by voices, warmth, and the gentle living music of home. Spring came quietly to Asheville. The snow melted into soft streams along the garden path, and the old swing in the yard swayed again, now repaired and freshly painted white. Everett watched from the porch as Sophie ran across the grass with a paper kite she'd made from old newspaper and string. Her laughter rose into the clear air, brighter than any bell. Grace stood near the steps, trimming flowers that had survived the frost. The past months had settled something deep inside her. The fear in her eyes had turned into calm. She looked up when she felt Everett's gaze. You're thinking again, she teased. Mostly just watching, he said. Sometimes that's enough. Sophie waved the kite proudly. Look, Grandpa, it's flying. He chuckled. So it is. You did well, kid. The wind caught the kite, pulling it higher until the string trembled in her hands. For a moment, it looked like a piece of light trying to stay in the sky. Grace came to stand beside him. You've changed, you know. Older, maybe, but softer. He smiled, eyes still on the child in the yard. That little one did what grief and time never could. She taught me how to start over. Grace's voice lowered. And you taught us how to stop running. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the rustle of trees and Sophie's distant singing. Later that afternoon, they gathered in the kitchen, the same kitchen that had once felt like a place of ghosts. Sophie helped stir lemonade. Grace baked a pie that filled the air with cinnamon and butter. Everett sat at the table, a small smile tugging at his lips. You know, he said softly, Marion used to say a house only lives when someone laughs in it. Grace looked up. Then this one's alive again, he nodded. Very much so. The clock chimed 5, sunlight spilling through the window in wide golden bands. Sophie ran in, her cheeks flushed. Grandpa, come see, the first fireflies are out. He stood, joints aching, but heart light. Grace followed as they stepped outside. The yard glowed with tiny sparks of green dancing over the grass. Sophie twirled among them, her laughter soft and endless. Everett stood still, his chest full. You know, he said half to himself, I used to think this house would end with me. Grace turned to him, her expression tender. Maybe it just needed a new beginning. The breeze moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. For the first time in years, Everett felt no weight pressing on his shoulders, only the quiet, steady rhythm of belonging. He looked toward the house, the open door, the warm light spilling from within, the sound of a child laughing. It was everything he'd lost and somehow found again. As twilight deepened, Grace whispered, What are you thinking? He smiled faintly. That love never really leaves a place. It just waits for someone brave enough to open the door again. Sophie ran back and grabbed his hand. Come on, Grandpa. We have to catch one before it's dark. He laughed, letting her pull him forward. Fireflies blinked all around them, small miracles in motion, lighting the garden like tiny lanterns. And as he followed her into the fading light, Everett realized that the house, his heart, his life was no longer a monument to loss. It was home again. The laughter, the wind, the soft hum of night, all of it blended into one quiet truth. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard such domestic music. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with grand gestures or second chances wrapped in gold. It arrives quietly like morning light through an old kitchen window. Everett Langston had spent years measuring life by balance sheets and property deeds, but in the laughter of a child and the courage of a weary mother, he discovered something no fortune could buy: the peace of belonging. His house, once an echoing museum of loneliness, had become a home again, filled with voices, warmth, and the gentle rhythm of ordinary love. It's a simple truth, really, that kindness, when given freely, can rewrite even the longest story of regret. Love doesn't erase the past, but it teaches us how to walk beside it without bitterness. Like a lamp glowing softly on a front porch in a quiet town, one small act of compassion can guide another soul, and sometimes it guides us too. Maybe tonight, as you sit with your cup of coffee or glance at the family photos on your wall, you'll think about someone you've drifted away from, someone who still deserves a bit of light, Because no matter how old we grow, we all need to be reminded that forgiveness is not weakness, it's how we begin again. If this story touched your heart, type 1 in the comments to let us know you felt its warmth. And if you think it could have been told better, type 0. Your voice helps us grow together. After all, life, much like a shared meal on a Sunday morning, is sweeter when we pass it around with love.